1929, Venezuela was pumping more oil than any country on Earth except the United States. Per capita, it was one of the richest nations alive. Today, it is the textbook case of what economists call the Dutch disease, the pattern where a resource windfall quietly poisons every other part of an economy, until that economy can't survive without the resource, and eventually can't survive with it either. Now rewind to a different coastline, colder, poorer, a country living on potatoes and herring at the northern edge of Europe. It found the exact same substance 4 decades later, and it caught the exact same disease, except it didn't. Today, that country owns roughly 1.5% of every publicly listed company on the planet, spread across more than 7,200 companies in 60 countries. Same jackpot, same start line, same disease sitting right there, waiting. One nation caught it and is still trying to recover its pulse. The other read the diagnosis and refused to get sick. This isn't a story about geology. It's a forensic audit of 3 decisions Norway made, and 3 countries didn't. We're running that audit right now. Here's the promise. 3 decisions: sovereignty over the resource, discipline in spending the windfall, and trust in the institutions built to guard it. Every country that stumbles into a fortune faces the exact same 3 forks in the road. Most don't even notice their forks. Norway noticed and chose deliberately every single time. But knowing what Norway did right only tells you half the story. So we're also going to run this identical audit against 3 countries that hit the same forks and went the other way: Venezuela, Nigeria, and a nearly forgotten Pacific island called Nauru. Same tests, wildly different report cards. 1. The sovereignty audit. Before we get to what Norway actually did, you need the mechanism underneath everything else in this video, because every failure we're about to look at traces back to it. Here's the resource curse, and the Dutch disease economics behind it. Explain the way it actually functions, rather than the textbook shorthand. A country discovers a resource, oil, gas, diamonds, doesn't matter which. Foreign capital floods in to buy it. That demand drives up the local currency. A stronger currency makes everything else the country produces, fish, textiles, furniture, more expensive to sell abroad, so those industries wither. Talent and investment pour into the one glamorous sector paying absurd wages and starve every other sector that isn't. Economists sometimes bundle the whole cluster of symptoms under a blunter label: the resource curse, the well-documented tendency for resource-rich nations to end up poorer, more corrupt, and more politically unstable than resource-poor ones. Norway effectively diagnosed itself with this before it had a single symptom, using warnings borrowed from countries that got there first. Sovereignty was the first vaccine. Norway asserted legal ownership over its continental shelf before the international oil majors could carve it up on their own terms, then spent the following decade building the domestic expertise to actually operate what it now owned, instead of just leasing it out and collecting a fee. Notice what that decision quietly rules out: a government that owns the resource on paper, but still depends entirely on a foreign company to physically extract it, hasn't cured the disease. It's just changed which invoice the money passes through before it evaporates. That's the part that matters for this audit, because sovereignty by itself is not the vaccine. Watch what happens when a country makes the identical declaration and gets the opposite result. Dutch disease hits Venezuela. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, folding every foreign concession into a single state company, Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. On paper, that's the same move Norway made, a state asserting ownership over its own resource. And for roughly 2 decades, it actually worked. PDVSA ran with genuine operational autonomy and deep technical bench strength, sustaining more than 3.4 million barrels a day and ranking among OPEC's top producers by 1998. Then came the decision that split the 2 countries' paths for good. In December 2002, a national strike aimed at removing President Hugo Chavez shut down PDVSA's operations for 9 weeks. The government's response wasn't to negotiate a return to work. Chavez fired striking PDVSA managers by name during his weekly television broadcast, dismissing them on the spot. By early 2003, the government had let go more than 18,000 PDVSA employees, roughly 40% of the company's entire workforce, including engineers, geologists, and drilling supervisors. Here's the everyday version of what that means. Imagine you inherit your grandfather's factory. You own it now, full sovereignty, nobody can argue otherwise. But in your first month, You fire every engineer who actually understands the machines, because they annoyed you, and replace them with people who agree with you instead. You still own the factory on paper. You just can't run it. That's Venezuela's sovereignty. It nationalized the deed, then gutted the operating manual. Venezuela's oil history splits cleanly into a before and an after that strike, and production never recovered to its pre-2002 level. It slid from roughly 3.2 million barrels a day in 2000 to 735,000 barrels a day by September 2023, having already broken below a million barrels a day as early as March 2019 due to a mix of corruption, mismanagement, and sanctions. Production has partially recovered since, reaching roughly 893,000 barrels a day in 2024 as some sanctions eased, which sounds like progress until you remember Venezuela sits on the largest proven crude oil reserves of any country on Earth. If you've searched around trying to understand how economists explain Venezuela's collapse, this is usually the specific afternoon that word mismanagement is quietly standing in for. It isn't vague. It has a start date and a head count. Compare that to what Norway did with its own version of nationalization. Its state oil company wasn't built to replace foreign expertise. It was built to absorb it, forcing every international partner drilling on the Norwegian shelf to bring the state in as a paying partner and teach it the business as a condition of access. Sovereignty, in other words, isn't a declaration. It's a maintenance contract. Norway declared ownership and then spent a decade building the competence to use it. Venezuela declared ownership and spent one very bad season firing the people who already had it. So here's one for the comments. If you inherited a company tomorrow, would you rather hold the deed with no staff who know how to run it, or have the staff and lose the deed? Tell me which one you'd actually survive longer with, because I don't think it's as obvious as it sounds. 2. The discipline ledger. Sovereignty gets you the money. Discipline decides whether the money still exists in 20 years. This fork is nastier than the first one, because sovereignty is a single decision made once. Discipline is a decision a government has to make again, every single budget cycle, for decades, while sitting on a pile of cash large enough to fix nearly anything wrong in the country. Norway's version of this, the handlingsregelen, the rule limiting annual withdrawals from its fund to roughly the fund's own long-run expected return, is well-covered ground by now, so we won't rewalk the basic mechanics here. What's less discussed is what discipline looks like when a country tries to build the same thing without the institutional plumbing to make it stick. Nigeria tried. In 2004, the government created the excess crude account, a savings buffer designed to bank oil revenue collected above a deliberately conservative budget benchmark price. Precisely so, a windfall couldn't get spent the moment it arrived. On paper, it's the exact same idea as the handlingsregelen. Separate the money you find from the money you spend. At its peak around the 2008 financial crisis, the account held close to $20 billion, and Nigeria genuinely used it as designed, drawing it down to cushion the crash without piling on new debt. Then the discipline evaporated. Unlike Norway's rule, the excess crude account was never anchored in a specific law defining exactly who could authorize a withdrawal from it. A 2022 legal analysis found that at various points the presidency, the central bank, and even a parliamentary resolution had each been cited as the approving authority for withdrawals, with no consistent answer, and in several cases no disclosed approving authority at all. In 2011, state governors sued the federal government to force a distribution of the account's remaining balance, and the fund was drained accordingly. Researchers who audited the fund's history estimate that nearly $70 billion that should have flowed into the account over the years never arrived, because the legislature kept revising the oil price benchmark upward to expand the annual budget, leaving nothing left over to save. By 2020, the account that had held roughly $20 billion a decade earlier held just $72 million. Here's the domestic version of that failure. Imagine two roommates who agree to put $50 each into a shared jar every week, for emergencies only. One pair writes the rule down, hands the jar to a neutral third roommate to hold, and agrees that breaking the rule means an actual embarrassing conversation in front of everyone. The other pair just has a jar. Nobody's holding it. Anyone can dip in if they can convince themselves it's important enough. Give it 2 years, and I think you already know which jar still has money in it. Nigeria's Sovereign Investment Authority, created in 2011 partly to fix the excess crude account's legal ambiguity, has fared somewhat better precisely because it carries an actual statutory mandate and answers to international investors who would notice if it quietly vanished. But even it has been dogged by transparency fights with its own legislature, including a 2021 threat from the House of Representatives to zero out its budget entirely after the authority refused to submit its accounts for legislative review. The lesson isn't that Nigeria lacks people who understand sovereign wealth theory. It built two separate versions of the same idea. The lesson is that a savings rule without an enforcement architecture, a whiteboard instead of a neutral jar holder, is a suggestion wearing the costume of a rule. It's worth being fair to the newer institution here, because the diagnostic isn't Nigeria is incapable, it's Nigeria is still mid-repair. A meaningful share of the Sovereign Investment Authority's holdings now runs through a dedicated domestic arm, the Nigeria Infrastructure Fund, which channels part of the savings into projects inside the country, under monitoring that researchers rate as considerably tighter than the old account ever had. That's a government visibly building the missing wall, one brick at a time, decades behind Norway's head start. Whether it finishes before the next commodity cycle tests it again is, honestly, the open question. Which is harder, in your opinion? Resisting the temptation to spend the windfall, or building an institution nobody can quietly loot? Drop your answer below, I read these. 3. The trust register. Sovereignty gets you the deed. Discipline gets you the savings. But there's a third decision sitting underneath both of them, and it's the one people wave away as simply culture, as if some nations are just born more honest than others. They're not. Trust, in the specific sense that keeps a sovereign fund solvent for 50 years, isn't a personality trait. It's a piece of engineering. Transparency thorough enough that theft gets noticed immediately, and oversight strong enough that noticing it actually changes something. Here's the case study that shows what happens when a country builds the fund but skips the engineering. In the 1970s, a tiny Pacific island called Nauru, 8 square miles, population in the low thousands, was sitting on some of the richest phosphate deposits on Earth, compressed fossilized seabird droppings that happen to make an extraordinary fertilizer ingredient. Nauru did the smart thing first. In 1968, it established the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, explicitly designed to bank the mining windfall for the generations who'd be left after the phosphate ran out. At its peak, the trust held somewhere around 1 to 1.3 billion Australian dollars in assets, including a namesake office tower in Melbourne, Nauru House. Nauru's musical meltdown. That's the sovereignty and the discipline both present, on paper. Nauru even out-earned Norway for a while on a per-family basis. One estimate suggests Nauru could have reached close to $4 million in assets per family by 2002, had its fund matched Norway's actual investment returns. It didn't come close. Here's why. There was no independent body auditing where the trust's money actually went, no equivalent of a finance ministry answerable to a functioning parliament, and no professional investment mandate walling politics off from portfolio decisions. So the trust ended up bankrolling whatever caught a minister's attention. It financed a West End musical about the romantic life of Leonardo da Vinci, an approximately $4 million production that closed within weeks to scathing reviews. It took out a 236 million Australian dollar loan from General Electric, specifically to pay off its other loans. Couldn't repay that one either, and General Electric seized the trust's international real estate portfolio, Nauru House included. Between 1990 and 2004, the trust's asset value collapsed from roughly 1.3 billion Australian dollars to about 300 million, and Nauru defaulted on its debts in 2002. Quick pause because we need one here. If a Pacific island funneling its national trust into a Da Vinci jukebox musical sounds absurd to you, same. I promise the rest of this video involves fewer flops on the West End. Speaking of flops, YouTube's algorithm treats an unsubscribed viewer roughly the way General Electric treated Nauru's real estate portfolio. It quietly repossesses your attention and hands it to someone else. Hit subscribe if you'd rather it didn't. And it isn't even a story about Pacific Islands being uniquely doomed to mismanage a windfall. Nauru's neighbor Kiribati set up its own phosphate royalty fund, the Revenue Equalization Reserve Fund, back in 1956, ran the identical experiment on a comparably tiny population, and largely succeeded in preserving the wealth across generations. Aside from one rough stretch between 2006 and 2009, when underperformance and unsustainable withdrawals briefly dented its value. Same region, same commodity, same colonial-era starting conditions. One island built a wall around the jar. the other didn't. That's not geography. That's the trust decision, made twice, with two different answers. Okay, back to the audit. Notice what actually failed in Nauru's case. It wasn't sovereignty. The phosphate mines were unambiguously Nauru's own. It wasn't even strictly a savings rule. The money genuinely went into a trust instead of being spent the moment it arrived. What failed was the third leg. Nobody built a wall between the money and the people with access to it. Compare that to Norway's fund, which publishes its full list of holdings, publishes every decision its ethics body makes about which companies it refuses to own, and requires its finance ministry to defend, in public, in parliament, exactly how much of the fund it wants to spend each year. Trust isn't Norwegians being inherently more honest people than Nauruans. It's a portfolio nobody can quietly musical away. 4. The Ethics Court. Here's where Norway's fund stops being a savings account and turns into something genuinely strange. A $2 trillion investor that also runs its own morality court. Until November 2025, Norges Bank's executive board decided whether companies should be excluded from the fund entirely or placed on an observation list based on recommendations from an independent council on ethics appointed by the Ministry of Finance. The council doesn't manage a single share. It only investigates and recommends. The list this produces is long. As of the end of 2024, the fund had formally excluded 104 companies on ethical grounds. In 2024, the board voted to exclude the Israeli telecom Bezek over risk tied to serious rights violations in situations of war and conflict, and the Russian steelmaker Evraz as part of the fund's documented 2022 divestment program covering its Russian holdings. That same governance machinery kept running. In August 2025, after a renewed review of its Israeli holdings, applying the same published ethical guideline criteria, the board excluded 6 additional companies with ties to the West Bank and Gaza, including Caterpillar and several major Israeli banks. Here's the part that makes this the perfect stress test for everything this video has been arguing about trust. In November 2025, Norway's parliament, the Storting, did something the fund had never experienced in over 2 decades of ethical exclusions. It froze the mechanism entirely. Following a domestic political dispute over how consistently the exclusion criteria had been applied, a parliamentary committee was formed to review the entire ethical framework, with a report due by October 15, 2026. And under temporary guidelines, Norges Bank's board can no longer decide new exclusions or observations at all, only reverse existing ones. Sit with that for a second. This is supposedly the most institutionally trusted sovereign fund on the planet, and even it just had its own ethics mechanism suspended by its own parliament in a live political dispute. That's not a contradiction of everything we've argued so far. It's the argument, working exactly as designed. Trust isn't a fixed trait a country either has or doesn't. It's institutional machinery that has to be re-legitimized constantly, in public, in front of elected representatives who can and do step in when that legitimacy comes into question. Nauru's trust collapsed in the dark, with nobody watching. Norway's is being renegotiated in daylight, with a named committee and a published deadline. Different outcome. Same underlying design principle. Nothing runs on autopilot forever, not even the model case. But does any of this ethics court apparatus actually change how the excluded companies behave? Or is it just theater with better public relations? Here's the uncomfortable finding buried in the finance literature. Stanford's Jonathan Burke, studying firms included or excluded from a widely tracked social responsibility index, found no measurable difference in their cost of capital at all, since selling a stock simply hands it to a different investor who doesn't share the concern, with no direct effect on the company's actual strategy. A related 2025 paper makes a sharper point specifically about exclusion as a tool. Unless enough investors divest in alignment with each other, a blanket exclusion gives the excluded company zero incentive to ever clean up its conduct, because it stays excluded either way, clean or not. Does divestment work? Here's the twist specific to Norway, though. A 2025 study analyzing NBIM's own publicly disclosed exclusion announcements found the picture isn't quite that bleak. But it is conditional. Exclusions were associated with measurable changes in a firm's subsequent behavior, specifically when Norway's decision aligned with a broader wave of institutional investors acting on similar grounds at the same time, while exclusions made without that wider alignment showed no behavioral improvement, and in some cases, simply saw ownership shift toward investors less concerned with the underlying conduct. There's a newer wrinkle worth flagging, too, because it changes how these decisions even get made in the first place. Starting in late 2024, NBIM began deploying large language AI models to screen every company entering its equity portfolio for ESG risk on day one, using them to scan public information at a scale no human analyst team could match, then flagging anything concerning for deeper human review. Whether that makes the ethics court faster or just faster at making the same kinds of calls is genuinely an open question. But it's a reminder that even the machinery for producing trust keeps getting rebuilt. Nauru's trust never even got a first version of that machinery. Norway's is already on what looks like its third or fourth. So, is Norway's morality court an actual court with real enforcement power? The best available answer is only when it isn't adjudicating alone. One for the comments here too. Does divesting from a company you disapprove of actually count as taking a moral stand, if the divestment alone doesn't change a single thing the company does? Argue it out down there. I'll be reading. 5. The spending rule under siege. Let's return to discipline, because there's a detail about Norway's own version of it that most explainers skip entirely. The handlingsregelen has never been a law. It carries no legal penalty for being broken, and Norway has no formal, legally binding fiscal rule setting explicit limits on deficits or debt. The handlingsregelen operates purely as a guideline rather than a strict, enforceable decree. It survives as binding political convention. And purely political convention should worry you a little, if you were paying attention 2 sections ago to what happened to Nigeria's discipline. So why has Norway's convention held for a quarter century, while Nigeria's legal savings account got hollowed out inside a decade? Start with the number itself. When the rule launched in 2001, the government estimated the fund's sustainable long-run real return at 4% and set the withdrawal guideline there. By the mid-2000s, with global interest rates grinding toward zero and the fund's own return outlook softening, an official commission concluded 4% was no longer a realistic long-run assumption, and in 2017 the government formally lowered the guideline to 3%. Notice what that is. A government voluntarily tightening its own spending limit, in a year with no financial crisis forcing its hand, purely because the underlying math had changed. That's discipline behaving exactly the way the textbook promises. And almost nobody outside Norway ever hears about the year it happened. Then came the actual stress test. In 2020, COVID-19 and a simultaneous collapse in oil prices hit the Norwegian economy at once. The government didn't quietly ignore its own rule. It invoked the framework's own built-in escape hatch, which explicitly allows the use of petroleum revenue to be adjusted in the event of large movements in the value of the fund or in the underlying fiscal deficit. In May 2020, Norway announced it would draw 382 billion kroner, roughly $37 billion, from the fund, more than 4 times its previous record withdrawal, and for the first time in the rule's history, a sum larger than the fund's entire annual cash flow from dividends and interest, forcing outright asset sales rather than spending pure income. By the revised budget later that spring, the withdrawal reached roughly 4.2% of the fund's value at the start of the year, comfortably above the 3% guideline. Notice, too, where the actual enforcement lives. There's no independent court that can strike down a Norwegian budget for breaching the guideline, because the guideline was never written into ordinary law in the first place. The enforcement is Parliament itself. Every single krone transferred out of the fund and into the national budget has to appear, itemized in a budget document, the Storting debates and votes on in public, every single year, whether the government is sitting comfortably under the ceiling or explaining why it isn't. That's the entire mechanism. Not a statute. Not a court. Just a standing requirement that the number be written down, in front of everyone, before it can be spent. Here's why that 2020 breach doesn't undercut the thesis of this video. It reinforces it. The rule survived being broken because breaking it required the government to say so, in public, on the record, inside the national budget document, exactly how far over the line it was going and why. There's no equivalent moment anywhere in Nigeria's excess crude account history. No public document where an administration states plainly, "What we are drawing this down beyond the agreed threshold, and here is our repayment plan." Nigeria's withdrawals happened through disputed authority, unresolved court fights, and at least one documented case with no disclosed approving authority whatsoever. Norway's 2020 breach happened through the front door, with a receipt attached. And the story doesn't end with COVID. As of 2025, an official fiscal policy committee, the same kind of body that recommended lowering the guideline back in 2017, has recommended reconsidering the rule's mechanics again, this time proposing a shift away from tying withdrawals to the fund's fluctuating market value and toward a steadier measure based on the fund's underlying cash flow, arguing the current approach leaves fiscal policy needlessly exposed to a market crash. 9 of the committee's 10 members backed studying the change, with one economist dissenting, and the sitting finance minister's public response was not to dismiss a challenge to a rule that has become nearly sacred in Norwegian politics, but to say it deserved serious open examination. That, right there, is what a discipline mechanism with actual teeth looks like in practice. Not a rule that's never questioned. A rule that gets stress-tested by a pandemic, bent in public with a paper trail, and revisited by name-brand economists in an open committee report, instead of a rule that just quietly stops existing the way Nigeria's did, with nobody ever writing down who authorized the last withdrawal. 6. Final thoughts. The audit's verdict. So here's the actual verdict of this whole forensic audit. Norway's oil was never the lottery ticket. The lottery ticket was finding it. What Norway actually won was passing 3 separate tests that almost every resource-rich country in modern history has failed at least one of. Sovereignty. Assert ownership, then build the competence to run what you own, instead of gutting it, the way Venezuela gutted PDVSA's own workforce in a single bad season. Discipline. Not just deciding to save, but building an enforcement architecture strong enough that the savings can't quietly evaporate the way Nigeria's excess crude account did, one undisclosed approval at a time. And trust. Not a cultural trait, but continuous institutional transparency. Tested in public, the way Nauru's trust never was, and the way Norway's own ethics council is being tested right now, in front of its own parliament as we speak. Quick honesty check before the verdict. This is institutional and historical analysis, not investment advice. Is Norway's system perfect? No. Its ethics court just got suspended mid-review. Its own economists are quietly rewriting its most sacred rule for the second time in a decade. That's not a flaw in the model. That's what a living institution looks like up close. Mid-repair. The dead ones, Nauru's trust, Nigeria's crude account, 3 decades of Venezuelan production data. Don't get committees arguing about how to improve them. They just stop. None of this required a uniquely honest population or some cultural gene the rest of the world happened to miss out on. It required 3 specific, replicable, occasionally boring institutional decisions, made under pressure and defended in public, again and again, for 50 straight years. Any country sitting on a windfall today faces the identical 3 tests. Most of them will still fail at least one. And here's the part of the audit that should actually unsettle you a little, rather than just flatter Norway. Passing all 3 tests once doesn't mean you've passed them forever. Every one of the 3 institutions we just walked through, the fund itself, the Ethics Council, the spending guideline, is currently being questioned, reviewed, or rewritten by the very government that built it. That's not the system cracking. A system that could never be questioned again would be the actual warning sign. The exact complacency that let a phosphate trust wander into musical theater without anyone in the room objecting. The difference between a nation that stays rich for 50 years and one that blows through a fortune in 15 was never about which one built a perfect machine. It's about which one kept checking whether the machine was still working, on the record, out loud, and was willing to publicly admit when it wasn't. What's coming next? If this forensic audit changed how you see a country you thought you already understood, that's the entire point of this channel, and it's exactly what the like button is for. Subscribe if you want the next audit the moment it's ready. And speaking of countries running this same test with a very different toolkit, the next deep dive puts this exact 3-decision framework up against a country trying to do in 1 decade, in the desert, what Norway took 50 years to build in the sea. Tell me in the comments which of the 3 decisions, sovereignty, discipline, or trust, you think is hardest to actually get right. I'll see you in the next one.